a disgrace, man.
Is it fixed yet or still not?
Not fixed.
Oh my God.
Everything's on battery here.
But Damon, I heard people are knocking down substations or like power lines and zicking the copper like the traffic lights.
But I have no idea. Without Gavin's kindness, I would have shot myself. He's giving me an opportunity
Okay.
to work at it, which has been amazing.
If you want me to, great. If you want me to say, I can actually. I've got 10 minutes here, so about 15 minutes I can give an answer here.
Yeah,
because I'm going on the bus.
Yes, give us an idea.
Excuse the noise, eh? So, Rabbi Matthew Liebenberg was the guest rov at the KLR and Nana Kollel show, and he gave a nice idea about this week's previous parsha we read today earlier on Mishpatim, and what he said was, the rabbi, so the rov of the show. So what he said was, in Mishpatim it says, if somebody takes out someone's eye, it's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a limb for a limb. You know that it's not literal, and we know that it's actually people have to make restitution by paying money for the loss and of income and humiliation, etc. caused. Because the reason being, it's actually not for if somebody blinds somebody, takes the eye out, and it may not be actually justice, because let's say that person has one eye, the guy that's now had his eye taken out by negligence. If the person that did it has only one eye, then he actually becomes totally blind. That was actually one of the examples. That's not actually justice. So that's why it has to be money. So that's how, and it's actually quite a novel idea. I don't know if you've heard that, Damon.
No, I haven't heard that. So that is interesting.
Yeah, so that's why it has to be money, because it's actually not justice. It's not fair, because the suffering that the guy that was negligent will suffer even worse.
You could say it the other way around, is that the perpetrator that accidentally took out the eye of a person that had normal vision, and if he had one eye, the perpetrator, by negligence, he would be totally blind. I think that's the right way to structure the statement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to say that.
I think it's important.
So you could be, on mute if you want.
No,
Yeah.
Kevin, that was amazing. Thanks, man. That was pretty cool.
It's actually excellent. I've never heard that before, because we know that you can't be literal, and we know it's money, but I never heard that. That actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense.
I'm going to put myself on mute.
It makes sense. Thanks, Kev. That was well done, but actually makes a lot of sense. So, guys, we had this issue that Rav, we say that, listen, at the end of the day, if he regards slaves as land in the brisa that we just learned, why is there another brisa that was quoted by Rav Daniel Bar Katina, who said in the name of Rav, one who seizes the slave of his fellow and the slave does work for him, he's not liable to pay the master for his use of the slave. And if it should enter your mind that a slave is regarded as land and cannot be legally stolen, why is he not liable to pay for the use of his slave, while the slave stands in possession of his master? So let me just simply put it across like this, is that the reason why when you steal a slave and it's aged, if it's returned, you can say, I'm returning your slave as is, because just like I cannot steal physical land, when I return a slave, if it's seen as fixed property like land, what have I stolen? You can't physically remove land. But for those who say slaves are like movable property, where it's like a cow or anything else that aged, you've created irreversible damage and detriment, then the robber would own the aged slave or the aged animal and make financial restitution at the higher value of what the slave was worth when it was in its full vigor, which was at the time of the robbery, not 5 years later when there was a court case. So we're saying that Okay, so then Rav says that you can return the slave as is just by mere virtue of the fact that it's regarded as land, and therefore what have you stolen, even if the slave has physically aged? But we say that that's a problem, because when we learn a later issuance of Rav, who says that if you steal the slave of your fellow and you get the slave to work, you don't have to pay the master for the work that the slave has done. Now we're talking in a case of robbery. In other words, not theft, because theft you pay double. So in that particular case, you hold a gun to the master, or you basically hold a gun to the slave, and you say, come work for me for the day, and you get him to work for you for the day. In that particular case, that's a robbery. So we're saying that if a slave is treated as land, then you should actually pay for that slave's labor to the master, because if you reside in somebody's premises, even if you haven't bought those premises, you need to pay rent. So that's a proof in this case, because Rav is saying that the master isn't paid for rent of the slave, he's not seen as land, he's seen as movable property, because the rule with movable property is you replace what you've stolen. In other words, if you work the slave to death, let's not use that. Let's use it, because then there's liable for the death penalty. Let's say you worked an animal to death, you just replace the cow. Or if you work the animal for the day in your plowing fields, and at the end of the day, you just return it to the original owner, your only obligation, according to the pasuk, is to return what you stole. And therefore, it would be in those cases that it's seen as movable property. So what it's saying here is, if Rav is paskening in this particular brisa that there's no money owing to the master for the slave, that by definition would be seen as movable property and not as land, which contradicts his previous statement as saying that a slave is seen as land. That's why when you steal it and it aged, it can be returned to the original owner, because you can't steal land and you can't steal a slave either. Do you get the issue at hand, guys? That's all I'm asking. No, Arthur is not technically present, but it's okay.
I am technically present, Dan. I can hear everything. I've got my headphones in.
Okay, so okay. All right.
Say hi. We're just working in the kitchen. We just got stuff to do.
No problem.
I have muscles.
Okay, but Kevin wants you to repeat everything, so you can repeat it again.
No, he doesn't.
About this. You just said, please repeat to everyone. You wrote a message.
Okay, were you battling to hear, Kev?
I think you're more present than Damon.
No, he is. No, Kevin's on the bus at the moment. Kevin's on the bus.
Sweet. That was a lovely comment. That was classic.
Okay. So Kev, now that it's a bit quieter, must I repeat what I said? Were you not hearing because of that? Okay. So what we are saying is, if the previous case was that, according to Rav, a slave is treated as land, and that's why if you steal a slave and it aged, you can return the slave to the original owner years later and say, well, what have I stolen from you? Just like I can't steal land, can't physically put land in my pocket. If a slave is categorized as fixed property, what have I stolen from you? And then the original owner of the slave loses out on the slave that deteriorated permanently because of the physical aging problem. But if a slave is seen like a movable asset, the deterioration causes the robber to acquire the slave, and therefore he must make restitution at the slave's value at the time of the robbery, which is higher because the slave was younger and more vigorous. Does that make sense? But that's not the problem. The problem is that if you're saying that Rav said in that brisa that a slave is treated as land, whether you're held by Rabbi Meir or the sages, because there are different opinions as to who says a slave is land, then the critical question here, Kevin, is that why does Rav say in the case of where one robs a person of their slave, gets the slave to work for the day, and returns the slave, he doesn't have to pay anything for that labor. Because if a slave is treated as land, if you resigned in land that you did not buy, you still owe rent on that land. But if it's a movable asset, the Chumash just says to you, you have to return what you stole. Even if you got that asset to work for you, you don't have to pay restitution for the labor, merely to return the asset that you stole. So this brisa seems to indicate that Rav sees a slave as a movable asset and not a fixed asset. That's the contradiction brought here. Are you able to hear that? And then we can go on. Make sense? Good. So the Gemara answers, in fact, I will tell you that Rav holds that slaves cannot be stolen. And what are we dealing with here in the case of Rav's ruling, cited by Rav Daniel, by Rav Katina, with where one seized and worked with a slave, not at the time of his master's work, in fact. In other words, that he seized the slave and worked him after working hours, right? Or at a time that the slave's master did not have any work for him to do. And the slave's master did not suffer any financial loss or loss of productivity, guys, on account of the seizure. And one who seized and worked with the slave is therefore not liable to pay for benefiting from the slave's work. Okay? Because it's a classic case of this one the user benefits and this one the owner does not lose, where the law that the beneficiary not need to pay for the use of the owner's property. So where did we learn this, guys? Do you remember we learned a case in Bava Basra, where a guy is a vagrant. And what happens is he goes in a guy's property in the animal shed, and he sleeps on a pile of hay. Now, that is obviously not going to be rented out by the owner of the farm, because nobody's going to sleep in those sort of circumstances. So in that case, the owner didn't lose out on revenue of renting the room, and the other Jew benefited. So when there's no loss to one Jew and there's a benefit from another, we don't make him pay. So therefore, if you kidnap a slave during working hours where the master would suffer a loss of their productivity or a loss of the income that that slave would have generated, there's indeed a loss, and the restitution would have to be made in that case, because it would be a case of losing out on rental. So if you had a B&B and there was a vagrant that slept in the bed where you could have rented it out, that is a sustained loss. But if, for example, that room you weren't going to rent out for the night because, say, for example, your bookings were until 9 p.m., like in my dad's B&B, and in that particular case, it's a different case, because this guy came at about 11 p.m., his car got stuck, he didn't have money, and you let him stay there for the night. It never cost you revenue because that room remained vacant. So it doesn't contradict the fact that Rav can see the slave as land, merely that the owner did not lose out on the rental of that sort of property, nor in this case lost out on the revenue of his slave working for the day, because the slave was kidnapped or used of his time, not during the working hours where the master would have suffered a financial loss, which I think is a clever answer, by the way, that the Gemara gives. So this is a case of that message which Rabba bar Abba sent to Rav Mari bar Mar. Inquire of Rav Huna whether one who dwells in a courtyard of his fellow without the owner's knowledge has to pay him rent, or he does not have to pay him rent. Okay. In other words, so that's a case, guys, where the occupant benefited and the owner didn't suffer a loss from the unauthorized occupancy. For the occupant was seeking to rent a place in which to live and is therefore benefited from his unauthorized occupancy. The owner, however, had no intention of renting these premises and thus suffered no loss of rental income on account of the unauthorized dwelling. This one benefits and this one does not lose. So the Gemara is saying here is a different case. In the first case that we dealt with, we were talking about a vagrant that had no intention of paying to crash over. Guy had no money. He was just a drifter, or his car got stuck, but he had no money. We're saying here, what happens if it's a case where a guy would have rented a place from somewhere else, but he chose to crash there and not pay, and he benefited, but he was fully intent on paying the money elsewhere. So he saved on rent. Do you get what I'm saying? But that one never lost because he never intended to rent out his place. So let's just say that there was a spare room that was there in the study. Now, if he never went to that spare room in the study, he couldn't have slept in the street. He might be somebody that is a little bit soft and is not a vagrant or a drifter or whatever, and would have paid to spend the night in a hotel. So therefore, that person benefited, the person that went to that room rent-free, but the owner had no intention of renting it because it was a spare room in the study in case his son came home from yeshiva and wanted to sleep there. So that's different to the previous case where a drifter had no intention of paying anyway. In this case, the one benefiting saved himself money. That's the difference in this case, and that's the question that Rav Abba sent to Mari Bar Mar. Okay? And the inquiry went to Rav Huna. So, and they sent back a reply to say he does not have to pay him rent. Right, so what it means is when one benefits from somebody else's property and the owner suffers no loss, the beneficiary need not pay for his benefit. So accordingly, the one who sees someone else a slave and worked him during non-working hours isn't liable to pay for that benefit, even though slaves cannot be stolen. So we're saying here, even in both the cases where the other one benefited because he didn't have to pay a slave to do the work, or a person would have benefited because they would have rented premises elsewhere, that doesn't negate the argument. Because as long as there wasn't a loss to the other Jew and the slave was stolen during non-working hours, or he had no intention of renting out that spare room that his son would have used had he been back from yeshiva, then you don't have to pay for rent of the services for the slave. So that's the proposition given. Now the Gemara rejects the comparison. Why? Because it says it's well understood there in the case of the unauthorized dwelling why he is exempt from payment. Because even though one might argue that when you occupy house, guys, you can cause wear and tear to the house and cause it to depreciate, it should be considered a case of this one benefit and this one loses. In other words, you're saying that it might not be a case of no loss occurs. Let me give you an example. Let's just say there's no structural damage. Now, where is Kevin gone?
Well spotted, eh? I didn't see that.
Okay.
See, you got the four of us, I think, on the screen. I've only got you primarily and the guys. So they're very small, so I don't see it as big as you do.
No problem.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, you got off. Okay.
Welcome, Kev.
Can you just repeat your last point? Sorry, I took you off by mistake because the
Sure,
one
no
bus just
problem.
drove past.
No problem at all. So what we are saying is the Gemara is saying this, and they're not happy with this because it's not a case of one person not losing and the other one benefiting. Because if a Jew benefits and the other Jew doesn't lose, there's no payment. Even if that other Jew would have saved money by renting someone else and he wasn't a vagrant that had no intention of paying, because they were two different points. Saying is here, you can't compare that with our case of the slave. Because in the case of property, there's one who benefits and one who does lose. What I mean one who loses is that there's detriment to the property. So I thought about it. It's unlikely that a vagrant that just comes past is going to damage infrastructure, especially if he's sneaking in there. He's not going to want to create noise. But let's call it a loss because he takes a shower, uses electricity, uses water, and costs the owner that amount. Say he's been staying there sneakily in the spare room down in the basement for 3 weeks. There might be electricity bills and water bills that have incurred a loss to the owner of that property. That's what the Gemara is saying. So you can't compare it to this case with the slave, where at the end of the day, there wasn't a loss to the slave owner because it was not during working hours. Okay? So whether according to the one who says that the exemption from rent is because an inhabited house remains habitable, the owner is content that the occupant is living there. Okay? And what do we actually say? Is we're saying, look, at the end of the day, we're not talking about a case in which the person isn't aware. He just doesn't bring it to the vagrant's attention because maybe he doesn't want to embarrass him. And maybe he's aware that he's there and he's using a bit of electricity and power, but he's also keeping the place occupied. So from a security reason, it looks like there's activity and it's less susceptible to robbery and theft. Because say he knows the vagrant and he knows he's the local vagrant, but he's not a thief and he just wants to keep clean and have a place to sleep. But that sort of activity of a light going on will deter robbers. So he's content with the person living there, even though the person isn't paying. So Rav Yosef actually explains that although the unauthorized occupant causes the house to maybe depreciate through wear or tear, or there's a bit of electricity and water used, that it's a cost to the owner. The loss of that is offset by the fact that he actually tends to the house's needs and saves it from becoming decrepit. So what might happen then is he might be a sort of guy that keeps the garden clean or decides to mow the lawn in return, or just keeps the place active so that it's not almost a quiet place where thieves can break in, where there's no activity whatsoever. So even though the owner's losing in a certain respect of slight overhead costs, he's gaining in the fact that there is sort of what do you call it, auxiliary benefits by having the person there. You know, it might be a case like that. So it is comparison. There is a comparison, okay? So whether according to the opinions, guys, that say that the exemption from rent is because of the verse, and Sha'iyah tears down the gate of a vacant house. So where's that from? If you look at Isaiah chapter 24, verse 12, Sha'iyah is the name of a demon of destruction. Alternatively, it means desolation, and the verse is to be rendered through desolation of the gate that's broken apart. So all we are saying is there are two reasons why the owner would be pleased if a vagrant is going to be there. The one reason is that it could be a deterrent as almost first phase security, where initially when they get on the property, they see there's a guy busy, there's lights on, there's music playing, and therefore they might not want to sneak in to the property. So that's a security deterrent. The second deterrent is what you call a spiritual deterrent. So we learn in Gemara Brochas that there's certain spiritual energies that are negative that reside in places where mankind does not inhabit. One of them are dark bodies of water. The other one is on vacant buildings. And that those spiritual energies that are negative can create a detrimental effect to the owner. So that sort of activity keeps those sort of spirits away from those areas because it's occupied. Okay? But here, guys, in the case of the slave and its master, the master's content that his slave becomes the Gemara is saying, but hang on, it's different here with the master and the slave, because at the end of the day, if you work as a slave during non-working hours and you're kidnapping and you're working through the night, Gavin, do you think he's going to have the energy the next day when you return him during working hours to the original master, that he's going to have the energy that he had to do a whole day's work if he worked throughout the night and sleep deprived?
It all depends whether he has fibromyalgia or not. Different way to answer it, but
Well,
obviously, no, I'm joking. Obviously, you need a good night's sleep.
yeah. So what it's saying is, you can't. The Gemara is saying you can't compare it to that other case, because here, if you kidnap a slave during non-working hours, say you've got a club and you kidnap this employee you're the mafia, so you kidnap that employee during non-working hours to be a bounce at the gate, and he's working till 5 a.m. when the party stops, and he's serving drinks or whatever, and he has to get up at 6 a.m. to do his logistical warehouse job. He's going to be finished, man. He's not going to do a proper day. And therefore, you've cost his employer or his master money, because that slave is going to be unproductive during the day because he's exhausted and sleep deprived. He just worked a double shift. So you say you cannot compare that with a case where there's somebody in a vacant house, and whether there are auxiliary benefits or no losses to the vagrant that's staying there, or the renter that's staying there that's not paying rent technically, you can't compare it to a case where the slave is now detrimentally exhausted and the master suffers the loss of productivity. I'm just waiting for Gavin.
Sorry, I was just warming something up. I just went to grab it. Sorry. I can hear you all the way while you're talking. Sorry.
All right, so Gavin, all we
Okay.
are saying is the cases are not analogous, because if you kidnap a slave to run your bar and your bouncing activities and that with a club, and you return in the next morning before his work starts at 6 a.m. and he's a warehouse manager, Oak's going to be destroyed. So you actually damage his employer or the slave's master because you fatigued the slave. It's different to a case where the owner wasn't going to rent out that room anyway. Somebody's residing in it, and even if he's using the water and electricity a bit, he's keeping the place active from a security point of view, and his benefit of being there doesn't bother the owner because it's first phase security. And there's no loss to the original owner because of the premises, because he wasn't going to rent out that room. That was a spare room that his son would use if he had to come back from the sugar, but he wasn't generally owning a B&B to rent the room out. But in this case, the master of the slave or the employer suffers a loss of productivity if the slaves work during non-working hours, because the slave is going to be weakened by the time he starts his normal shift. You can't work for days on end, Gavin.
No.
So they say this case is not comparable. So the Gemara says, they say in this case here too, the master is content with the person working with his slave during the off hours, so that his slave does not become habituated to leisure. So what it's saying is the master actually benefits from the fact that his slave is working, for if the slave were left to while away his time, he would develop a habit of laziness. So here too, the slave's master's benefit is offset by creating good habits for the slave, even though the slave is a little bit weakened in return. Now, I don't really resonate with this concept, but I'm just teaching it. So the Gemara relates, in the household of Rav Yosef Bar Kamma, they would seize the slaves of people who owed them money and have the slaves do work for them. Because when the masters had no work for them, that was the criteria, okay? Rava said, Rava, his son, said to him, what's the reason that the master does this? In other words, how do you work with the slaves that don't belong to you? How do you get them to work? So Rava's words weren't addressing this factor to his dad in a tone of criticism, more curiosity, right? So he would never show his father disrespect. He just wanted to know the rationale. So Rav Yosef Bar Kamma said to him, Rav Nachman said, a slave is not worth the bread of his stomach. In other words, it costs more to feed a slave than his work is worth. Since I feed the slaves for a period that they work for me, I'm actually doing a favor for their masters. So what it's saying is that even if a slave is employed, his work is not really profitable to his master, but merely a convenience. The master is satisfied that someone else should work his slave and feed him. So Rav questions his father's reply. Rav said to his father, say that when Rav Nachman said his disparaging comment regarding slaves, he's actually only referring to slaves such as Daru, his own slave. Because he had this particular slave working for him, guys, that used to get shikha, go into taverns, start dancing around, drinking wine, whatever. The guy was a useless slave. And in that case, to feed him cost more than he was worth in productivity. But they're saying in all other cases in general, you get more output out of your slave than the money it costs to feed them and keep them going. So it was just used in this particular example. So Rav Yosef Bava Kamma offers further justification for his action. And he said to his son, I hold in accordance with Rav Daniel bar Rav Katina, who said in the name of Rav, one who seizes the slaves of his fellow and does work with him is not liable to pay the master for use of his slave. So we can see from Rav Daniel's ruling that the master is content that another person is working his slave, so that the slave does not become habituated to leisure. Okay, guys, I'm just reading what it says in the commentary and the note. I honestly don't quite understand it, because if somebody is not working for you during certain hours, why can't they relax? Maybe I come from a different century. What do you mean it's going to make them lazy? I don't get it. I really just don't get it. Because when they have to work for you, when people work for you on a salary, they probably would rather watch Netflix, but they're working for you because they need to pay rent and stuff. People are lazy at times when the time is there of their leisure, but Hashem holds that person responsible for not learning Torah at that time. And the slave's master, what does it have to do with him if his slave goofs off in his own time? It's his own time. So guys, I don't get it. But there is a question I get that Rava asked of his father, problem. He said, look, that applies when the one seizing the slave is not owed money by the slave's master. But when you're the master, since you owed money by the slave's master, it gives the impression of ribus when you work with his slave. So what it's saying is, okay, well, the son was asking the father, what happens when you have a situation where somebody owes you money and they can't pay off their debt yet? Or they're in the process of paying you, but people see that his employee is working for you. That gives the impression that you as a Jew are charging interest, because up until the time that he pays you the loan, what you're doing is you're making use of his assets. It's like earning interest by virtue of the favor you've done by him. In other words, if you lend the person 10,000 rand, they should pay you back 10,000 rand. You don't have the right in the interim to use their goods as interest for them until they pay you the capital amount back, because we're not allowed to charge ribas. And even though that might not be the case, in other words, in a normal circumstance, if it's not during working hours, you don't have to pay back the slave master for the work that the slave has done. And that's if you see a slave as land. But if you see a slave as immovable, you just have to return the article that you stole. You don't have to pay the byproduct of that article. So either way, the question that's asked here by Rava to his father Rav is, he said basically, you're giving an impression that if somebody owes you money, that you can use their slave in the meantime. It's like earning interest, because otherwise, why would you entitled to be using their slave? And we learned that you can't charge interest, and therefore it's marit ayin. You're not allowed to give the impression of charging interest, because some people might think it's allowed if somebody as great as you does such a thing. So, how do I know that a lender may not take such gratuities from the borrower? For Rav Yosef bar Manyumi said in the name of Rav Nachman, although the rabbis have said that one who dwells in the courtyard of his fellow without the owner's knowledge does not have to pay him rent, nevertheless, if you lent him money and then dwelled in the courtyard of his fellow, he has to pay him rent. So the son is actually using this example and saying, look, at the end of the day, if you lend somebody 10,000 rand and they haven't paid you back yet, and a Jew doesn't pay interest to another Jew, but he's got a place at Umschlanger. In the meantime, you say, listen, I'm coming to Umschlanger for business. I lent you money. I did you a favor when you need it. I'm going to stay at your place rent-free because I need a place. And I did you a favor. You can do me a favor. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to do, because that's like charging interest rivers. And you can't even give the impression of that. And even if you do stay there, you have to make a public acknowledgement that you've paid the guy rent, because you've got to actually not get benefit from ribos of doing that sort of favor. So we're saying that that impression is a big deal. So Rav Yosef Bava Kamma was persuaded by his son's arguments, and he said to him, I retract my opinion and will desist from seizing such slaves in the future. So in other words, he's saying, look, it could give that impression, and in future, I'm not going to create that impression because people might get the wrong idea. Okay? All right, guys, we're done. We're 4 minutes shorter than we should be, but I'm happy we went at a fast pace. I don't know if you guys were happy with the faster pace.
Yeah, based on the material, yeah, that was
Thanks,
perfect.
man.
Thank you.
Damon.
Thank you. Are you still not
I
home,
left-
Kevin? Shame, man.
No, I left 2 hours ago. And they've visited this protest to go, and I'm going to have to catch another bus. It'll take me 3 hours to get home from Ranana. I'm not catching a taxi on
Crazy.
principle. Rip you off.
That's
By
absolutely.
the way, can you guys hear me better on this mic?
What did you say? Oh, stop it.
Can you guys hear me better?
Say again.
Yeah.
Like, I bought a mic that's a boom mic now. You see, it's got a boom down here with a.
Oh, Michael.
It's better.
Yeah, I know. It actually was the same make. I didn't know. It's a Solar Ear X. I didn't know it was that X1 or X3. And I had the Solar Ear Solo. I didn't know it was. It's a lovely headphone set. Good quality. Okay, guys. Thanks for the training. I enjoyed it. I was listening the whole way through. I was attentive. And
Your
James,
daughter has such a funny chirp.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, but what I worked out, James, is, you know, the slave thing I understand with you. It's fine. I'm your slave, not Jay.
Oh, come on. That's a terrible.
I'm playing with you. I'm teasing you. I'm teasing you. No, matey, but we need to talk tomorrow. I'm going to get hold of him tomorrow because I'm taking Ivan in the morning and I'll be back at about 3:30 or something, or maybe earlier. And then I want to call them and sort it out because I don't have a full day tomorrow. I've only got a bit of time, 3 hours I'm working, so I have time to sort it out tomorrow. Just last week I was hectic the whole week.
Then we can sort out invoices also tomorrow and stuff.
Yeah.
All right, listen,
Everything else.
I really appreciate